What is the biggest question that we must ask as Christians? Is it whether we are saved? Is it when is Jesus coming back? What is the greatest question for us as Christians? Now, we don't need to wonder what it is, because the scriptures tell us what it is. The greatest question that we can ask and find an answer to is, who is Jesus? Now, there are two conclusions we can reach when we ask that question. The first one is, Jesus is who he claimed to be. That he was the Word who was there in the beginning, who was there with God, who was God. That he is the only begotten Son of God. Begotten, not made or created, but begotten. Or we can conclude that Jesus was a lunatic. He was a mere human being who was mad and crazy and didn't know what he was talking about. We cannot take a middle ground. There are many who have chosen to take the middle ground. We have said he was a great man, but he was not God. And he was not mad. But we can't do that. We can't deny what the scriptures say about who he was. He claims to be the Son of God. He claims to be God, as you'll see as we go through today's passage. Now, the Gospels, the books of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, were written exactly to answer this question of who Jesus is. In the book of John, chapter 20, verse 31, John tells us that he wrote the book of John to show that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that by believing in him, we may have life in his name. That's the reason John wrote. He wrote to show that Jesus is the Christ, is the Messiah, the Son of God, and that if we believe in him, we will be saved and have life in him. The other Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, they also were written to answer the same question. I've mentioned before that when you find something that the Synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke cover, all of them, you must realize that that point is very critical. Because there are areas where they differ and there are areas where they are the same, they cover the same events. And this story of today is one of those that all of them cover. It is covered in the book of Matthew chapter 16, in the book of Mark chapter 8, in the book of Luke chapter 9. Now, the Gospel of Mark gives us a few pointers of why Mark was reaching to the climax of answering this question of who Jesus is. In Mark chapter 2, we are told about the story when Jesus healed the man who was paralyzed, whose friends brought to him so that he can heal him. And we're told that before he healed him, he forgave the man. And the people around him, the scribes, the people who knew Jewish law, said, who is this man who claims to forgive sin? Only God can forgive sin. And Mark gives us that as a hint to say people were wondering, trying to figure out, who is this man Jesus? In verse 28, still of Mark chapter 2, we are told about Jesus being the Lord of the Sabbath. So as he goes on through the book of Mark, you discover that Mark is trying to answer this question of who Jesus is. In Mark chapter 4, after Jesus and the disciples were in a boat crossing the Sea of Galilee, and they were about to drown, and Jesus is walking up to stop the storm from drowning them. He then stops the storm, and they looked at each other and say, who can this be that even the wind and the sea obey him? Verse 41 of Mark chapter 4. So throughout the book of Mark, this is the question that Mark keeps planting in his story to show us that the issue he's trying to address is to answer the question of who Jesus is. So when we get to chapter 8, which is today's passage, Mark chapter 8, verse 27 to 38. Mark then goes exactly to the original point of what it is that he's trying to address. And he let Jesus himself ask the question. So I would like us to read then our passage for today from the book of Mark chapter 8, from verse 27. Jesus and his disciples went on to the villages around Caesarea Philippi. On the way, he asked them, "Who do people say I am?" They replied, "Some say John the Baptist, others say Elijah, and still others, one of the prophets." "But what about you?" Jesus asked. "Who do you say I am?" Peter answered, "You are the Messiah." Jesus warned them not to tell anyone about him. Verse 31. He then began to teach them that the Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders, the chief priests, and the teachers of the law, and that he must be killed and after 3 days rise again. He spoke plainly about this, and Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. But when Jesus turned and looked at his disciples, he rebuked Peter. "Get behind me, Satan," he said. "You do not have in mind the concerns of God, but merely human concerns." Then he called the crowd to him along with his disciples and said, "Whoever wants to be my disciple must deny themselves and take up the cross and follow me. For whoever wants to save their life will lose it. But whoever loses their life for me and for the gospel will save it. What good is it for someone to gain the whole world yet forfeit their soul? Or what can anyone give in exchange for their soul? If anyone is ashamed of me and my words in this adulterous and sinful generation, the Son of Man will be ashamed of them when he comes in his Father's glory with the holy angels." So Jesus himself asked the disciples, what are the people saying about him? What do the people say Jesus is? And they tell him that some say you are a great prophet, you are maybe Elijah. And then he says, okay, I hear what others are saying. What are you saying to people or to yourselves about me? And Peter correctly answers very quickly. He says, you are the Messiah. You are the Christ. Now, although Peter gave the correct answer to that question, Peter had a particular idea of what kind of Messiah Jesus was. You see, in the Jewish mind, the Messiah was going to be a warrior who was going to lead the people of Israel out of the bondage and suppression of the Roman Empire, that they can once again establish the kingdom of Israel under a descendant of David. And Jesus, they knew, was born as a descendant of David, and he was going to be the king who was taking over the rulership and the kingdom of David. And so in his mind, when he says you are the Christ, you are the Messiah, you are the anointed king, he was not thinking of the Savior who was going to die on a cross. He was thinking of a Savior who was going to lead them in arms and defeat the Romans and free the people of Israel. That's what Peter had in mind. That's why you find later he fights with the people who come to arrest Jesus. That's why later when Jesus is being arrested and you can see Jesus is going to die, he denies him. Because Jesus was not living up to the image that he had of what the Messiah was going to be like. So that's the important part that I wanted to focus on. We need to ask ourselves, when we say we understand who Jesus is, do we mean he is what he really is, or he is what we think he is? Like Peter probably was doing in that answer that he gave. So there are many ideas that today, as Christians, we have of who Jesus is. And it's important that we are very clear about who Jesus is in himself, not in the imagination and creation that we've made in our minds. So I'd like to address a few of these ideas that we have about who Jesus is. The first one is that many people think of Jesus as the magician. as a miracle worker, as a promise keeper. There is a song we sing often. And that song, in fact, is the signature tune of our online church service. We play it in the beginning of the service and we play it at the end of the service. Now, what do we mean when we say Jesus is a promise keeper? That he is a miracle worker. Because sometimes if we are not careful, and that song is good and I like it, and that's why we're using it as a signature tune for our church services. But unless we understand what we mean that Jesus is a miracle worker, unless we understand what we mean when he says he's a promise keeper, we will fall into serious troubles and problems. There are many who have turned Jesus into a magician, and they mimic him by performing these magical tricks to people to entertain them and to attract them so that they can come to them. And sadly, there are many Christians today who are deceived by that, because the kind of Jesus they have in their mind is a Jesus who is a magician, who does things that are not explainable. And that's the Jesus they want to follow. And many who deceive Christians have figured that's what people want to believe in. A Jesus who is a miracle worker, who is a magician. And they produce these magic tricks. And they fool a lot of people. Thousands of people are fooled every week, every day by these people who are performing these tricks. And we can easily be fooled by that. If the Jesus we have in our heads is a Jesus who is a miracle worker, who is a promise keeper, that we use him to do our own thing and not to achieve his purposes. That's something we need to be careful about. Because sometimes we make promises and we make God, we make Jesus to be the ones who's making those promises. And he never made them. And therefore we get disappointed. And some people have even lost faith because they felt that Jesus has not kept his promises to them. And Jesus never made those promises. They are promises that they made to themselves. And they wanted Jesus to make them. But Jesus didn't make those promises. It is them who made them. And they end up being disappointed. So we need to be careful that the Jesus in our heads is not the magician, it's not the miracle worker in our own idea of who that is. We need to keep Jesus to who he really is and not fall into the trap of thinking of him as the magician that many want him to be. Now, secondly, there are others who think of Jesus in nationalistic terms. They think of Jesus as the white man, as a Jewish man, as a man that belongs to whites or to Jews for that matter. We know that apartheid was built on this idea that the Afrikaner people believed that they were the covenant people of God and that Jesus belonged to them and to them alone. That the rest of us were not really welcome. They did not welcome us into their churches. They did not want to worship with us. They don't want to fellowship with us. They don't want to interact with us. Because the Jesus they believed in was a white man. He was a Jesus who was white, who was interested in white people and not anybody else. But sadly, there are also black people who have fallen into the trap of believing that in fact, that is who Jesus is. That he is a white man who is interested in white people only and doesn't care about black people or any other nationality for that matter. And yet, that is once again one of those false dichotomies, one of those false conclusions we reach about who Jesus is. And if we are not careful, we make the same mistake that many have made about Jesus. That we continue to think of him in those terms and we miss the point of who he really is. Because Jesus is not a Jewish man. He was born in a Jewish family, but he was not a Jewish man. His ancestry itself will show you that if you are interested. There are 5 women who are mentioned in the ancestry of Jesus. And 4 of them were foreigners. They were Gentiles. They were not Israel. So Jesus, even in his lineage, in his ancestry, he was not a pure Jewish man. He was a mixed race. He represented all of us. If that is what will make you believe whether Jesus was for you or not. But the idea that Jesus is a white man for white people, for Jewish people, is a false idea. It is a lie of the devil. We must never believe that, both as black people and as white people. Because when we do that, we reduce Jesus to something that he is not. Thirdly, there are some who choose to think of Jesus as a liberator, as a revolutionary, a man who has come to liberate the oppressed in the world. In fact, there is a whole field of theology that developed from those who believe this idea that Jesus was a revolutionary liberator of Israel, of the Jewish people. There is something called liberation theology, which is the theology that is used around the world to help people who are oppressed in society to think of Jesus. That it may help in the short term for people to think of Jesus as their liberator. But we miss the point if we reduce him to that. Because Jesus is not there for that. He was not there for the Jews to do that. Although Peter thought of Jesus as a revolutionary leader was going to lead them out of the oppression of the Romans, that's not who Jesus was. His purpose was not to come and free them from the Romans. And there are many, even in our own country, South Africa, who believe that Jesus was on the side of the black people to liberate them from apartheid. But that's not who Jesus was. The fact that we eventually got apartheid defeated, God was involved in that. But that's not who Jesus was about. He is not a liberator of the oppressed. He does liberate the oppressed, but we need to be clear about what oppression is liberating them from and how his freedom actually works, and not fall into the trap of seeing him simply as one of the political leaders that we follow every day, that we look up to as our leaders. Now, you're probably familiar. There are many people who, in fact, because of thinking of Jesus in those terms, of being a revolutionary, of being a liberator, people have exalted Mandela to the state of Jesus. Because they see Mandela as a revolutionary liberator, and they see Jesus in the same way. And in their heads, Jesus and Mandela are the same. There are some who also think of Mahatma Gandhi in the same way, that he was the one who freed the Indians from British colonialism. And they think of Jesus in the same way people think of Mahatma Gandhi. So all the sayings of Mahatma Gandhi, all the sayings of Mandela, all the sayings of Jesus, people think of them in the same way. They give them the same weight. But we know that Jesus was not a Mandela. He was not a Mahatma Gandhi. He was the Son of God. His words are not simple quotes that we can quote here and there. It is very fashionable to quote Nelson Mandela in politics. You'll hear people always saying, the former president Nelson Mandela used to say. They like quoting him, they like quoting Mahatma Gandhi. And they'll quote Jesus in the same way. But I don't want us to fall into the same mistake of thinking of Jesus as a revolutionary liberator like Nelson Mandela was or Mahatma Gandhi was. Jesus was the Son of God. He was God. And Mahatma Gandhi was a mere man. Nelson Mandela was a mere man. We must never fall into the trap of thinking of Jesus in that way in our minds. Because when we do that, we make a serious error of judgment, and our own lives begin to reflect that. We don't give him the respect and the worship he deserves. We treat him like the way we treat Nelson Mandela. We must be careful of doing that, because that's how others have thought of him. Now, there are others also who have thought of Jesus as a feminist who came to liberate the oppressed, and specifically women. And they will use the various ways Jesus interacted with women and what role women played in the ministry of Jesus to advance this idea that Jesus was a feminist at the core of who he was. But that too is a false dichotomy of who Jesus actually was. Yes, he affirmed and empowered women. But it is not because he was a feminist. It is not because he believed feminism is an ideal that we should be striving for as a people. Now, we should not oppress women. Jesus stood for that. But we must not reduce Jesus to feminism as an idea. that he is there primarily and simply to do that. Because there are others who have done that. And because they've reduced into that, everything they see in the gospel is about that. And then they miss the point of what he came to do. And lastly, there are others who think of Jesus as the great healer. Somebody that when we are sick, we must run to because he will heal us. Now, last weekend, I was speaking to my brother from Limpopo, and he was telling me about one of the main churches in the area where I grew up. They've lost 5 pastors in the last few months from COVID. And they were getting this COVID at funerals where they were going to bury members, but many of them, I don't know whether they did that or not, probably believed that God is going to protect them from COVID. And they might not have stuck to the requirements of putting on masks or sanitizing and so on. They believe that they are praying very hard before they go there, and therefore God will protect them. But 5 of them died, and by the time the 5th one died, they realized COVID was going to finish them off. And that's when they realized they need to take this COVID seriously. Now, there are many in our midst, in the world today, Christians, who believe and think of Jesus in this way. They reduced him to somebody who simply heals us. That his whole being is about being a healer. That when we are sick, he will heal us of any diseases. That when we are exposed to dangerous diseases like COVID, that he will protect us. And there are many, in fact, who believe that the COVID vaccine is a bad idea and they are not going to have it because they believe that it is going to be a mark of the beast, and therefore they don't want to take it on for that reason. And they are dying because of this ignorance and how they think of Jesus. For me, it is very sad that it is Christians who are anti-COVID vaccines. And it's based on a false idea of who Jesus is and what he came to do. So I want us to, as we reflect on this question of who Jesus is, not to fall into the trap of thinking of Jesus in these various ways that I've explained. Because when we do that, we reduce him to something that we have created in our own imagination, but not in terms of who Jesus revealed himself to be. That's the mistake we must not make. So I want us to avoid that. In the passage we've read, it says, as soon as Jesus told them that indeed he is the Christ, he told them he's going to suffer and he's going to be killed. Because he wanted to already show them that the idea that they have of the Jesus who is the liberator is not who he was going to be. And we see that even until the night he shared the Last Supper with them, they were still thinking of him about to take over the kingdom of Israel from the Romans. 2 brothers, John and James, asked him, when you come into your kingdom, you must make us your right man and your left-hand man. Because they continue to think of him as the liberator of the people of Israel, of the Jews. And yet Jesus was continuing to tell them that that is not who I am. In fact, he continues in the passage that we read earlier. In verse 34, he says, he called the crowd to himself. Now this, he was speaking to the broader crowd, not only to his disciples. Remember earlier, the conversation was between him and the disciples about who he is. Then later, it says he called the crowd to him along with the disciples. And he said, whoever wants to be my disciples must deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. Now, why did he have to say that immediately after they've declared him to be the Messiah? Because many of them were thinking that the Messiah is going to give them a good life. That the Messiah is not going to allow them to suffer. But he just told them he's going to suffer and be killed. And he said, whoever wants to follow me and be my true disciple must be willing to follow me in this suffering. So if you want to know who Jesus is the Son of God who suffered in the hands of man. That is why in the Apostles' Creed, one of the statements says that we believe in Jesus Christ, the Son of God, who suffered under Pontius Pilate. If you don't remember that Jesus came and suffered, he was the suffering servant of God in the world, you tend to think that your life must not have any suffering. Yet Jesus says, those who want to be my disciples must deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. Because that's the true Jesus. The Jesus who said, if you want to follow me, if you want to be my disciple, take up your cross and follow me. And that is the Jesus that you and I must always keep front and center in our minds. Because any other idea of Jesus is a distraction from that which Jesus has called us to. And we must not fall and fail, make that mistake of thinking of him in any other way. And that's the point I want us to make today. That Jesus did not come to be our promise keeper, to perform miracles for us, to heal us, to liberate us from oppression, to make us rich. All these things are an abomination or a distortion of who Jesus was. Jesus came to save us from sin. He didn't come to save us from poverty. He didn't come to save us from political oppression. He didn't come to save us from male oppression if we were women. He didn't come to perform miracles to entertain us. He didn't come to heal our diseases in this life. Yes, he will heal them when we are raised back to life, when he returns and we're changed. We will no longer be sick. There will no longer be disease. There will no longer be pain and sorrow. But in this life, Jesus said, you shall have many troubles. And if we think as Christians that we will not experience any problems in this life because we are Christians, because we are followers of Jesus, then we don't know who Jesus is. We are missing the point of who Jesus was and is. So I want us to remember that today, to reflect on that issue of who is Jesus for me. Have I created Jesus after my own image, after my own interest? Or am I believing in the true Jesus who came to suffer for humans and die for their sins, that they may be saved, that we may be restored to the image of who God created us to be? Okay? Jesus does not exist because of us. We exist because of him. He doesn't exist for our sake. We exist for his sake. And therefore, he needs to be the center, not us. Most of the other ways that I've described just now, only when we think of ourselves as the center, then we think of Jesus in that way. That Jesus needs to fit the center that we are. But when he is the center, we need to be molded in his image, not him in our image. And if we are molded in his image, then we know that he came as the suffering servant of God. And he says to us, those who want to be my disciples must deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. Because that is the true Jesus. That is the Jesus who walked the earth. He wants us to live that kind of life. He hasn't come to promise us a good life in this life. He has come to promise us salvation. And he says if we want to follow him, that's what we must do. He doesn't want us to waste our time thinking of ourselves. In the book of Matthew, he talks about us losing our souls to gain the world. And he says nobody can rescue us if we do that. He came to save us, to restore us to the original design of God. And I hope as we conclude today, you can question yourself, you can reflect on this question and say, who have I thought of Jesus as? Because if I've thought of him in any of those ways, how is that impacting my life? How is that impacting the way I relate to him? Has that affected my Christian walk? Because the way we think of Jesus, the way we think of God, influences how we worship, how we relate to him, how we relate to each other. And I want us to have a correct view and idea of who Jesus is. So as we conclude today, I want you to go away and reflect on this question. Who is Jesus for me? Is he the Son of God who came and suffered for me and has called me to join him in that suffering as we advance towards the kingdom? And that one day when he comes back, then there will be no more suffering, no more pain, no more death, no more sorrow. Because that's the Jesus that came and lived and died for you and I. Amen.